What if I told you that the greatest coach of his generation once had the chance to work with the most talented player of his era, and it ended in silence? No public fight, no press conference drama, just a quiet, painful realization that some partnerships are destined to fail. This is not a story about tactics or trophies. This is a story about respect, frustration, and the moment two football minds realized they were speaking different languages. This is the story of Neymar and Pep Guardiola. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel for your support. Thank you for subscribing. The first time Pep Guardiola watched Neymar play in person, he didn't speak for 20 minutes afterward. It was a preseason friendly, years before they would ever share a training ground, and Guardiola sat in the stands with his arms crossed, his eyes tracking every movement, every touch, every moment of improvisation that made the Brazilian impossible to predict. Around him, scouts were talking about speed and statistics, but Guardiola wasn't listening. He was watching something else entirely. He was watching a player who seemed to exist outside of structure, who made decisions that no system could teach, who turned football into something that looked less like a game and more like a conversation between the player and the ball. When someone finally asked him what he thought, Guardiola only said one thing: he's perfect. And then he paused, and then he added, or he's impossible. Years later, when the opportunity finally came, when the transfer rumors turned into negotiations and the negotiations turned into signatures, Guardiola told his staff that this was the challenge he had been waiting for. Not the player who already understood the system, not the talent who would simply execute instructions, but the artist, the one who would force him to evolve, to adapt, to build something new. He said he wanted to see if genius could be guided without being controlled, if creativity could exist within discipline, if Neymar Jr. could become the proof that his philosophy was flexible enough to contain even the most unpredictable force in world football. His assistant coach smiled and said it sounded like an experiment. Guardiola didn't smile back. He said every great team is an experiment. And then he went home and stayed awake until 3 a.m, drawing diagrams of movements that didn't exist yet, trying to map out how a player who thrived on chaos could fit into a system built on absolute certainty. The night before Neymar's first training session, Guardiola called a meeting with his coaching staff. They gathered in the video analysis room, and for 2 hours they watched footage of Neymar from every angle, not just highlight reels, but full matches, tracking his movement patterns, his decision-making triggers, the moments when he chose to dribble versus when he chose to pass. One of the assistant coaches pointed out that Neymar's positioning often violated basics, principles of spatial awareness, that he would drift into areas that tactically made no sense, yet somehow he always emerged with the ball or created danger. Guardiola nodded slowly. He had seen it too. The question wasn't whether Neymar was brilliant. The question was whether that brilliance could be channeled without being diluted, whether you could give him guidelines without building him a cage. Guardiola looked at his staff and said something that would haunt him for the next 11 months. He said, "We're not going to change him. We're going to elevate him. We're going to give him the structure that allows his chaos to become devastating instead of just entertaining." One of the younger coaches asked how they would do that. Guardiola stared at the frozen image of Neymar on the screen, mid-dribble, 3 defenders around him, and said, "I don't know yet, but we'll find out together." Neymar arrived on a Tuesday morning in August, and the photographers captured the moment he stepped onto the training pitch for the first time, grinning like a man who had just been handed the keys to a kingdom. He shook hands with everyone, made jokes in 3 different languages, and juggled the ball 40 times in a row, just because someone asked if he still could. The players loved him immediately. He had that effect. He made people feel like they were part of something magical just by standing near him. But when Guardiola walked onto the field, the atmosphere changed. Not in a hostile way, just in a focused way. Guardiola didn't do small talk during training. He barely even did greetings. He nodded at Neymar, handed him a bib, and pointed to a position on the field. Neymar jogged over, still smiling, still loose, still acting like this was just another day. But his eyes were watching Guardiola now, studying him, trying to figure out what kind of coach he was dealing with. Neymar had played under demanding coaches before, tactical coaches, coaches who wanted control. But there was something different in Guardiola's eyes, an intensity that wasn't about ego. It was about perfection. And Neymar wasn't sure yet if he wanted to be perfect or if he just wanted to be free. The first drill was simple, a possession exercise. Keep the ball moving, find the open man, maintain the rhythm. Standard stuff. Guardiola explained the rotations carefully, showing how the left winger would drift inside when the fullback pushed forward, how the midfielder would drop to create a passing lane, how everything was connected in a sequence that required everyone to move in synchronization. Neymar listened, nodding along, but his mind was already somewhere else. He was seeing the game not as a pattern to follow, but as a puzzle to solve in real time. When the drill started, Neymar touched the ball 4 times in the first sequence, and every single touch was technically perfect, but none of them followed the pattern Guardiola had just explained. He flicked it when he was supposed to pass. He turned when he was supposed to release. He dribbled when he was supposed to circulate, and every time, he made it work. Every time, the ball ended up in a better position than it would have been if he had followed the plan. The other players hesitated, unsure if they should adapt to Neymar or stick to the structure. Some tried to follow him, breaking their own positions to support his improvisation. Others held their ground, waiting for him to come back to the system. The result was beautiful and chaotic at the same time. It looked like jazz being played over a classical symphony. Technically impressive, but fundamentally discordant. Guardiola stopped the drill. He didn't shout. He didn't criticize. He just walked over to Neymar and asked him a question. "Did you see the runner on the left?" Neymar nodded. He had seen him. "Then why didn't you pass?" Neymar smiled, that same easy smile, and said, "Because I saw something better." Guardiola stared at him for 3 long seconds, and in those seconds, both men were calculating. Guardiola was trying to determine if this was arrogance or intuition. Neymar was trying to determine if Guardiola wanted obedience or excellence. Then Guardiola said, "Show me." They ran the drill again. This time Neymar did exactly what Guardiola wanted. He passed early, he moved into space, he followed the rotations. It was textbook, it was flawless. It was everything Guardiola had designed. The ball moved like water, flowing from one player to the next without resistance. And when the sequence ended in a tap-in goal, the simplicity of it was almost elegant. Guardiola nodded and said, "Good." But Neymar didn't say anything. Something in his expression had changed, just slightly, just enough. Because what he had just done was correct, but it wasn't him. It was efficient, but it wasn't creative. It was the system, but it wasn't the art. And for the first time since he had arrived, Neymar felt the weight of what this partnership might actually cost him. That evening, Neymar sat in his apartment and called his brother. He talked about the training session, about the drills, about Guardiola. His brother asked if he liked the coach. Neymar paused. Then he said something that surprised even himself. He said, "I respect him, but I don't know if I can play for him, not long term." His brother asked why. Neymar struggled to put it into words. Finally, he said, "Because he wants me to be great in his way, and I've spent my whole life being great in my way. I don't know if those two things can exist at the same time." His brother told him to give it time, to be patient, to trust the process. Neymar agreed. But that night, lying in bed, staring at the ceiling, he couldn't shake the feeling that he had just signed up for something that might break him before it made him better. The first month was strange, not bad, not explosive, just strange. In matches, Neymar was brilliant. He scored goals that defied logic, created chances that didn't exist 5 seconds earlier, and made defenders look like they were moving in slow motion. Against one particularly defensive opponent, he received the ball near the halfway line, surrounded by 3 markers, and somehow threaded a pass through all of them to a teammate making a run that only Neymar had seen. The stadium erupted. Guardiola clapped from the sideline, but even as he applauded, his mind was analyzing. The pass was magnificent, but it came from a position Neymar wasn't supposed to be in. He had drifted away from his assigned zone, leaving a gap that could have been exploited if the ball had been lost. It worked out this time, but what about next time? What about against a team that could punish those gaps? The fans adored Neymar. The media called him the missing piece. The team won every game. But in training, there was a tension that no one wanted to acknowledge openly. Guardiola would explain a movement, and Neymar would execute a variation. Guardiola would demand discipline, and Neymar would offer inspiration. They were both right. That was the problem. Every time Neymar improvised and it worked, it proved that his instincts were valuable. Every time Guardiola's system produced a goal through pure mechanical precision, it proved that structure mattered, and neither man was willing to admit that the other's approach might be just as valid as his own. The other players began to sense the tension. In the locker room, they would talk quietly about it. Some sided with Guardiola, believing that team success required sacrifice and discipline. Others sided with Neymar, believing that football was supposed to be joyful and expressive, not mechanical. But no one said anything publicly. No one wanted to be the person who acknowledged that the partnership everyone had celebrated 2 months ago was already showing cracks. The breaking point came in November, during a training session that should have been routine. They were working on pressing triggers, the specific moments when the team would collectively move forward to win the ball back. This was one of Guardiola's obsessions, the idea that defending wasn't about individual effort, but about synchronized movement, about 11 players reading the same cue and reacting as one organism. He explained it 3 times, showed video examples from their last match, walked through the positioning step by step, pointing out how the trigger was always the same when the opposing center back received the ball under pressure and had his head down. That was the moment. That was when everyone pushed. He made them practice it in slow motion first, then at half speed, then full speed, and then they ran the drill. Neymar pressed at the wrong time. He went early, broke the line, forced his teammates to either follow him and abandon their positions or hold back and leave him isolated. He went on instinct, reading the body language of the defender, seeing a moment of hesitation and attacking it, and he won the ball. Cleanly. He intercepted the pass, turned, and within 3 seconds, the team had a counterattack opportunity. But Guardiola stopped everything. He called Neymar over, and this time, his voice wasn't calm. This time, there was an edge, a sharpness that made everyone else on the pitch freeze. You pressed too early. Neymar shook his head, confusion mixed with frustration. I won the ball. Guardiola's jaw tightened visibly. You broke the structure. You left 3 teammates exposed. If that defender had made a different pass, if he had seen the space you created behind you, we would have been in serious trouble. Neymar laughed, but it wasn't a happy laugh. It was a frustrated laugh, the laugh of someone who felt like they were being criticized for doing something right. I won the ball, Pep. We have possession now. We're attacking. Isn't that the point? Guardiola took a step closer, and his voice dropped lower, more intense. The point is that we do it together. The point is that when one person decides the rules don't apply to him, the whole system collapses. You're not playing street football anymore, Neymar. You're not in Brazil playing for fun with your friends. You're playing for a team that depends on structure, on trust, on knowing that everyone will do their job. Neymar's smile disappeared completely. His voice came out quieter, but harder. I've always played for a team. I've won everything there is to win. Championships, titles, individual awards. I've done all of that by trusting my instincts, by reading the game, by making decisions that coaches couldn't predict, because the game itself is unpredictable. Maybe your system isn't the only way to play football. Maybe there's more than one path to success. Guardiola stared at him, and for a moment, neither man spoke. The other players had stopped moving entirely now. Everyone was watching, holding their breath, waiting to see what would happen next. Finally, Guardiola spoke, and his words came out measured but firm. Maybe it isn't the only way, but it's my way. And if you want to be here, if you want to be part of what we're building, you follow it. Not because I'm right and you're wrong, but because a team can only have one direction, and I'm the one who sets that direction. Neymar stared at him for 5 long seconds, and then, without saying another word, without any dramatic gesture or angry outburst, he simply turned and walked off the training pitch. Not in rage, not in protest, just walked straight to the locker room, alone, leaving 22 players and 4 coaches standing in stunned silence. That night, Guardiola sat in his office and watched footage of Neymar for 3 straight hours. Every touch from the last month, every decision, every moment of brilliance and every moment of chaos. He was looking for a pattern, for a way to integrate the unpredictability into the plan, for some formula that would let him keep the best of Neymar without sacrificing the integrity of the system he had. Spent years perfecting. He made notes. He drew diagrams. He tried creating hybrid roles that would give Neymar freedom in certain zones while maintaining structure everywhere else. But the more he watched, the more he realized that Neymar didn't have patterns. He had instincts. He had moments. He had a relationship with the game that was emotional, intuitive, and completely impossible to diagram on a tactical board. It was like trying to write sheet music for thunder. You could describe it, but you couldn't control when it struck or how loud it would be. And Guardiola, for all his genius, for all his success, for all his ability to transform players into perfect components of a perfect machine, didn't know how to coach that. He only knew how to control it, or eliminate it. Neymar didn't show up to training the next day. Not because he was being unprofessional, not because he was trying to make a statement or force a confrontation, but because his body had finally given him an excuse, a minor hamstring strain, nothing serious, nothing that would sideline him for weeks, but enough to keep him in the treatment room, enough to give him a medical reason to step away, enough to give both men space to think without having to face each other immediately. The team doctor examined him and recommended 5 days of rest and rehabilitation. Neymar agreed without argument. He spent those days alone mostly, working with the physiotherapist, doing the exercises, icing the muscle, but his mind was elsewhere. He kept replaying the confrontation, kept hearing Guardiola's words, kept wondering if he had made a mistake coming here. The team kept winning without him. Guardiola's system kept functioning, kept producing goals, kept grinding down opponents with relentless precision. And somewhere in the back of Neymar's mind, a question started forming, quiet at first, but growing louder each day. If they don't need me to play the way I play, if they can win without my creativity, without my instincts, without the chaos I bring, then what am I even here for? Am I just a name on the roster? Just a marketing tool? Just another piece that's supposed to fit into someone else's vision? When Neymar came back, something had shifted. He was quieter, more careful. He followed the instructions exactly, down to the smallest detail. He didn't improvise unless the situation absolutely demanded it. He stayed in his zones. He pressed when he was supposed to press. He passed when he was supposed to pass. He became, on the surface, the player Guardiola wanted him to be: efficient, disciplined, reliable, and he was miserable. Not because he was being benched, not because he wasn't playing well, not because the team was losing. They were winning more than ever. But every time he touched the ball, every time he felt that familiar urge to try something unexpected, to trust his instincts, to take a risk, he heard Guardiola's voice in his head: the system, the structure, the team. And he suppressed it. He made the safe pass. He stayed in position. He did his job, and the joy was gone. The freedom was gone. The thing that had made him fall in love with football as a child, that sense of possibility, that feeling that anything could happen if you were brave enough to try it, was gone. And the worst part was that no one seemed to notice except him. The results were still good. The team was still winning. The media praised his maturity, his adaptation, his willingness to sacrifice for the collective. But Neymar felt like he was disappearing, like he was becoming a shadow of himself, and he didn't know how much longer he could sustain it. In December, they played a crucial match against one of their biggest rivals. The kind of game that defined seasons. The stadium was packed, the atmosphere was electric, and the pressure was immense. Guardiola gave his team talk, emphasizing patience, emphasizing structure, emphasizing that they would win by staying disciplined and waiting for the right moments. Neymar listened, nodded, and went out onto the pitch determined to follow the plan exactly. For 70 minutes, he did. He worked hard, he pressed intelligently, he made the right passes, he stayed in his position. And the team was losing 1-0. They had controlled possession, they had created half chances, but they hadn't broken through. The opponent had defended brilliantly, staying compact, forcing everything wide, eliminating space. With 20 minutes left, Guardiola made substitutions, changed the shape slightly, and tried to inject fresh energy. But nothing changed. The clock kept ticking, the fans grew restless, and Neymar, standing on the left wing, felt something building inside him. A pressure, a need, a voice that said, "This is the moment. This is when you stop following the system and start trusting yourself." In the 83rd minute, Neymar received the ball near the touchline, 30 yards from goal, with 2 defenders closing him down. According to the system, he was supposed to pass backward, recycle possession, let the team reset. But he didn't. He dropped his shoulder, shifted his weight, and attacked the first defender with a sudden burst of acceleration. He beat him with a feint so quick the defender stumbled. The second defender came across to cover, and Neymar cut inside, dragging 3 more players with him, creating space that hadn't existed 2 seconds earlier. He could have passed. There were teammates open, but he didn't. He kept going, dribbling through traffic that should have been impossible to navigate, his feet moving faster than anyone could track. And then, at the edge of the box, with 4 defenders around him and the goalkeeper charging out, he did something that no tactical plan could ever account for. He chipped the ball, not hard, not high, just enough. It floated over the goalkeeper's outstretched hand, over the reaching leg of the last defender, and dropped into the net. The stadium exploded. His teammates mobbed him. The fans screamed his name. And Neymar, buried under a pile of celebrating players, felt something he hadn't felt in months. He felt like himself again. When he looked toward the touchline, Guardiola was clapping. But his face was complicated. It wasn't joy. It wasn't relief. It was something closer to resignation. Because Guardiola knew what that goal meant. It meant that Neymar had ignored everything they had worked on. It meant that he had abandoned the system at the most critical moment. And it had worked. It had saved the game. It had produced the equalizer that would eventually lead to a winner 10 minutes later. But it had also proven something that Guardiola had been afraid of all along. That Neymar's greatness existed outside of control. That it required freedom. And that freedom, in Guardiola's world, was dangerous. Because if it worked this time, Neymar would try it again. And maybe next time, it wouldn't work. Maybe next time, it would cost them. And Guardiola didn't know how to manage that uncertainty. His entire philosophy was built on eliminating uncertainty, on creating patterns that could be repeated, on building machines that worked the same way every single time. But Neymar wasn't a machine. He was lightning. And lightning doesn't strike the same place twice. After the match, they didn't speak. In the locker room, everyone was celebrating, but Neymar and Guardiola avoided each other's eyes. It wasn't hostile. It was just heavy. Like both of them knew a conversation was coming, and neither wanted to start it. That conversation came 3 days later, after a routine training session, late at night, when most of the staff had gone home. Neymar was sitting in the locker room, still in his kit, staring at his phone, but not really looking at it, just sitting there, processing everything, trying to figure out what he was doing with his career, with his life. Guardiola walked in, saw him there, and sat down 2 seats away. Not right next to him, just close enough. They didn't speak for a full minute. The silence wasn't awkward. It was just present. 2 people who had too much to say and no idea where to start. Then Guardiola said, "You played well today." Neymar nodded. "Thanks." Another silence. Then Guardiola said, "But you weren't happy." It wasn't a question. It was an observation. Neymar looked at him, and for the first time since that November confrontation, he didn't hide it. He didn't put on the professional mask. He didn't give the diplomatic answer. He just said, "No, I wasn't." Guardiola leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped together. Why? Neymar thought about how to answer that. He could have said a lot of things. He could have talked about creativity, about expression, about the difference between playing football and executing football, about how he grew up in the streets of Brazil where there were no tactics, just kids and a ball and imagination. But instead, he said something simpler and more honest. Because I don't feel like myself anymore. When I'm on that pitch following every instruction, staying in every position, making every safe decision, I feel like I'm pretending to be the player you want instead of being the player I am. And I'm good at pretending. I can do it. But it's killing something inside me. And I don't know how much longer I can keep doing it before there's nothing left. Guardiola nodded slowly. He understood that. More than Neymar probably realized. Because Guardiola had spent his entire career trying to perfect a system. Trying to build something that was bigger than any individual. Trying to prove that football could be beautiful and controlled at the same time. But sitting there, looking at one of the most talented players he had ever worked with, a player who could do things with a football that seemed to violate the laws of physics, he realized that his system had done exactly what it was designed to do. It had made Neymar fit. It had turned the chaos into order. It had transformed the unpredictable into the reliable. And in doing so, it had made him smaller, not less effective, but smaller, less himself. Pep spoke quietly. his voice carrying the weight of someone who was choosing his words very carefully. I want you to understand something. What I do, the way I coach, it's not about taking away your talent. It's not about control for the sake of control. It's about making sure that talent serves the team, that it doesn't just shine in moments, but that it builds something that lasts. Individual brilliance is beautiful, but it's fragile. It can't be sustained over a season, over multiple competitions, over years. Systems can be sustained. Systems can be repeated. Systems protect players, they make average players good, and good players great. That's what I believe. That's what I've built my entire career on. Neymar listened, and he could hear the sincerity in Guardiola's voice. He wasn't being dismissive. He wasn't being arrogant. He genuinely believed what he was saying, and that made it harder, because Neymar couldn't just dismiss it as a coach on a power trip. This was a philosophical difference. This was two people who both loved football, who both wanted to win, who both wanted greatness, but who defined greatness in fundamentally different ways. Neymar spoke carefully. I know, I respect that. I understand what you're trying to do, and I've seen it work. Your teams win. They dominate. They play football that's beautiful in its precision. But what if the way I play is part of who I am? What if asking me to change that is like asking me to stop being me? What if my creativity, my instincts, my willingness to take risks, what if that's not just a tactic I use, but the actual core of how I see the game? And what if trying to fit that into a system, trying to make it predictable and controllable, what if that's like trying to schedule when lightning will strike? You can build structures to handle lightning. You can install lightning rods, but you can't tell lightning when to happen or where to go. It just happens. And maybe some players are like that too. Guardiola didn't have an answer for that. He sat there, staring at the floor, and for one of the few times in his coaching career, he didn't know what to say. Because the truth was, he didn't know if there was a way to have both. He didn't know if his philosophy could truly coexist with a player like Neymar, or if one of them would always have to compromise. And compromise, for both of them, felt like losing. For Guardiola, compromise meant weakening the system, creating exceptions that could spread and undermine everything he had built. For Neymar, compromise meant suppressing the instincts that had made him who he was. And neither man was willing to lose. The season continued. They won trophies. They broke records. They played some of the most technically perfect football anyone had ever seen. Sports analysts wrote articles praising Guardiola's tactical genius. Highlight reels showed Neymar's goals and assists. On paper, everything looked successful. But behind the scenes, something had broken. Neymar's smile never fully came back. He went through the motions professionally, but the spark was gone. And Guardiola never stopped feeling like something was missing. He would watch other teams sometimes, teams that played with more chaos, more risk, more individual expression. And he would wonder if there was something valuable in that approach that his system couldn't accommodate. They were successful, but they weren't happy. They were functional, but they weren't magical. And both of them knew it. The end came quietly. No dramatic exit, no public falling out, no leaked stories to the press. Just a meeting at the end of the season, in Guardiola's office, behind closed doors, where Neymar said he thought it was time to move on. Guardiola didn't try to convince him to stay. He didn't argue. He didn't list the trophies they could still win together. He just asked one question. Do you regret coming here? Neymar thought about it for a long time. Finally, he said, no, I learned a lot. I grew as a player. I understand the game differently now. I have more discipline, more tactical awareness. But I also realize that I can't be great if I'm not free. And your system doesn't allow freedom. It allows excellence. It allows success. It allows beauty of a certain kind, but not freedom. And I need freedom the way other people need air. Without it, I'm technically alive, but I'm not really living. Guardiola nodded. He respected that answer, even if it hurt, even if it felt like failure. Even if it meant admitting that his system, for all its brilliance, had a limitation he had never wanted to acknowledge. They shook hands. They said things that were polite and professional. Neymar thanked him for the opportunity. Guardiola wished him success. And then Neymar left. He walked out of the office, down the corridor, past the training rooms and the trophy cases and the photographs of victories. And Guardiola went back to his desk, opened his laptop, and deleted every tactical plan he had ever made that included Neymar's name. Not out of anger, not out of spite, but out of acceptance. Because he finally understood that some players aren't meant to be coached the way he coached. They're meant to be trusted. They're meant to be set free and allowed to find their own way. And he didn't know how to do that. His entire identity as a coach was built on guidance, on structure, on providing the framework that allowed talent to flourish. But Neymar didn't need a framework. He needed a canvas. And Guardiola only knew how to build frameworks. Years later, a journalist asked Guardiola if he had any regrets about his time with Neymar. It was during a press conference for a different team, a different season. But the question caught him off guard. He paused, and for a moment, that careful media persona slipped away. He looked genuinely vulnerable. Then he smiled, that thin, thoughtful smile he always had when he was being honest rather than strategic. He said, "I regret that I tried to change him. Not because change is wrong, but because I was trying to make him fit my vision instead of adapting my vision to fit him. I should have asked myself different questions. Not, how do I make Neymar work in my system, but how do I create a system that enhances what makes Neymar special? I didn't do that. I was too rigid, too convinced that my way was the right way. And maybe it is the right way for most players, but not for all players." The journalist pressed him, asked if he thought they could have won more if he had done that. Guardiola shook his head. Maybe, maybe not. Football isn't that simple. You can't just rewrite history and assume different decisions would have led to better results. But I know this. We would have been more beautiful. We would have had more joy. We would have created moments that people would remember, not because they were tactically perfect, but because they were magical. And sometimes, that matters more than winning. Neymar never spoke publicly about his time with Guardiola in detail. Whenever journalists asked, he would give generic answers about respect and learning experiences. But once, years after, in an interview with a Brazilian magazine, someone asked him what the hardest thing about his career had been. Not injuries, not pressure, not transfers, but the hardest thing emotionally. Neymar didn't hesitate. He said, "Playing for someone who saw football as a science when I saw it as a poem. It wasn't that one view was right and one was wrong. They were both right. They were both beautiful. But they were expressed in different languages, and we both loved the game. We both dedicated our lives to it. We both wanted greatness, but we loved it in different languages, and neither of us was willing to learn the other's, not because we were stubborn, but because learning the other's language meant losing fluency in our own. And we had both spent too many years becoming fluent to give that up. The truth is, they were both right. Guardiola's system created dynasties. It turned good teams into great teams, and great teams into historic teams. It won championships, broke records, changed how football was played at the highest level. Neymar's instincts created moments that people would remember forever, goals that seemed impossible, passes that defied logic, performances that felt less like sport and more like art. But together, they created something else, a lesson. That greatness doesn't always multiply. Sometimes it just collides. Sometimes two brilliant things can occupy the same space but can't enhance each other. Sometimes the most respectful thing two brilliant people can do is admit they weren't meant to work together. Not because one was wrong, not because one was less talented or less dedicated, but because both were too right in opposite directions. And when two forces pulling in opposite directions are both that powerful, something has to give. And usually, what gives is the partnership itself. The last time they saw each other was at an awards ceremony, 2 years after Neymar had left. It was one of those massive events where everyone important in football gathered, where legends and current stars mingled, where the cameras captured every interaction. They were seated at different tables, surrounded by other players, other coaches, other legends. The ceremony went on for hours, speeches and highlights and tributes. And at some point, during a lull between presentations, their eyes met across the room. Just for a second. Maybe two. Neymar raised his glass slightly. Not high enough for anyone else to notice. Just a subtle acknowledgement. Guardiola nodded, just a small movement of his head. No words, no need for them, just an acknowledgement, a silent agreement. That they had both tried, that they had both given everything, that they had both been honest about who they were and what they believed, and that sometimes, even when everyone tries their best, even when everyone has good intentions, even when everyone respects each other, the chemistry just isn't there. And that's okay. That's not failure. That's just incompatibility. And sometimes, knowing the difference is the wisest thing two people can do. And in that moment, in that brief exchange of glances across a crowded room, they both understood something they couldn't have understood when they were working together, when they were in the middle of the tension, when they were trying so hard to make it work, that the story of Neymar and Guardiola wasn't a tragedy. It wasn't a failure. It was just an incompatibility, a mismatch. Two incredible forces that existed better separately than together. And there was dignity in accepting that. There was wisdom in walking away without resentment. There was maturity in being able to look at each other years later and feel respect instead of regret. Because they hadn't destroyed each other. They hadn't broken each other. They had simply recognized a fundamental truth, that some partnerships, no matter how promising they look on paper, no matter how much everyone wants them to work, are destined to teach rather than to triumph. And the lesson they taught was this, that greatness comes in many forms, and sometimes the forms are incompatible, and that's not anyone's fault. It's just the nature of greatness itself.